This show is made possible by our Patreon supporters. To get access to our exclusive content and support the show, visit www.patreon.com/EABB podcast. That's www.patreon.com/EABB podcast. Thanks.
Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band podcast. I'm Chris Troiano, joined always by Stephen Canastrisi.
Hello.
This is episode number 46, and today we are speaking with Kenneth Brungess. Kenneth Brungess is an expert on Gold Rush era brass bands out in California. He is the founder of the Old Columbia Brass Band, the Dorado Brass Band, and the Gold Rush Cornet Band. Kenneth is also the author of a book titled Gold Rush Maestro, the Journal of August Wetterman. You'll hear in the episode that August Wetterman is a brass band leader out in California during this Gold Rush era, which Kenneth dates from 1850 to 1885. So we're really excited to share with you this kind of underground era of early American brass band history. Definitely something that's not talked about as much as maybe the Civil War or British brass bands. We're very excited to get to share this with you today.
Definitely, yeah. As Chris mentioned, this is a often overlooked part of brass band history in the United States, so we're excited to get it out to you. And as always, if you like what you're hearing on the show, you can support us on Patreon. We also have a Teespring store where you can buy some physical merch, as well as some of Chris's arrangements. And we're on all social media platforms, so give us a follow over there. And you'll definitely want to subscribe to our YouTube channel as we're coming out with more episodes for season 3. And for this episode, make sure you take a look on the show notes because Kenneth has a special deal for our listeners on the book that Chris mentioned, as well as the featured album for this CD. You can get kind of like a pack of 3 items for a discounted price. So make sure you go to our show notes page on our website. That's eabbpodcast.com. And I think it's time to roll the tape.
Let's do it. This is episode 46 with Kenneth Brungess. Enjoy. Thank you so much, Kenneth Brungess, for coming on to the Early American Brass Band podcast. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and talk with us about the Gold Rush era brass bands out kind of in the West. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, I'm pleased to be here, and thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. This is a really interesting area of American history that we're going to get to talk about today, and I'm really excited about it. It's not really a secret that the early American brass band is normally kind of like, or centered on the Civil War and kind of highly concentrated along the East Coast. So I'm really excited to be able to dive in and share this history that I know a lot of people aren't familiar with. Can you give us a brief background on your musical upbringing and what got you interested in this area of brass band research?
Well, it was almost a foregone conclusion that I would be involved with music. I can recall, age 7 or 8, starting to sing in boy choirs, getting on the train and going a few miles north as a kid with my little valise up to a town called Pottstown, which you may know has a famous museum of brass instruments, trumpet museum there now. And my mother was also a fan of Sousa. So we had a lot of original 78s. We lived also very close to Willow Grove Park. which, as you probably know, was after the Marine Corps Band, was one of the places that Sousa conducted, although we didn't see him. We went to concerts there. Also, we visited Allentown, which the famous Allentown Band. So in spite of the fact that my mother was kind of choral and organ-centric, she was very good about exposing me to a lot of band music. And then in the 50s, there was this wonderful, inspiring thing that happened on television. There was this guy named Leonard Bernstein, not to be confused with Bernstein, not related, who made incredible use of a medium known as television. And in the 50s and into the 60s were the young people's concerts. And he was, Bernstein, generally known as Lenny to his friends, I was not among them, made incredible use of that medium as an educator, in addition to being a fine composer, and an incredible conductor. I became enamored with the idea that one could use an orchestra or an ensemble as their instrument. He was playing the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. And at some point in junior high school, I decided I wanted to be a conductor. That's kind of hard to do in junior high school. And so I needed to learn to play an instrument. So I decided to play trumpet, because that seemed to be the instrument that was a part of most of the ensembles, including jazz, which became a passion of mine. Seemed to be the instrument. And so that got me into the brass world.
Was the element of like music history or American history kind of an interest at the same time, or did that kind of develop out of your eventual research and interest in the Gold Rush era?
I think, of course, as I mentioned before, again, thanks to my mother and all of those great recordings and some of those concerts that we went to, even a place called Ringing Rocks in Pennsylvania, which is another place where there were a lot of band. I went to a lot of band concerts and heard all that, but it wasn't until after having developed a really all-inclusive high school music program in Southern California, I got a grant to teach at UC Irvine and developed the instrumental music programs there. I was fortunate to get a job at Columbia College, which was coincidentally in the right smack dab in the gold country, Sierra foothills. It was a brand new college. It was an arts magnet, humanities college, and they wanted me to start the instrumental music program. Well, Columbia College was right next door to the most beautifully restored gold rush town known as Columbia, the gem of the Southern Motherload. One of the first things that I did, and all the visitors do, is we walked into their little museum, and encased in a couple, I saw an E-flat cornet, a piston valve E-flat cornet, and then I saw a rotary valve E-flat cornet, and then I saw a piccolo, not a fife. I saw a couple Albert System clarinets. I saw a pouch that said CBB for Columbia Brass Band. I saw some part books, and all of a sudden my heart's pounding, and I'm thinking, my goodness, they had, quote, a band.
Yeah.
Not realizing that was the proverbial tip of the iceberg, that there were a number of bands right in just that one town.
Wow.
Starting as early as 1850.
Yeah.
So that was the catalyst. That was the spark. And so that was 74. Well, America's bicentennial was already looming. I really started getting interested in this. I started doing some cursory research, got a number of grants, Of course, the college loved this. This was great publicity.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately formed the first, it was my first living music history project, which was the Columbia Brass Band. Although I was pretty naive, unlike so many of your wonderful guests that you've had so far, that I've had a chance to see on your YouTube channel. I was still pretty ignorant about not necessarily, the literature, but also some of the instrumentation. So I did sneak in some woodwinds. But that was as much political as anything else, because they were players from my college, from my wind ensemble that I wanted to include.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a company that you may have heard of that's been around, second or third oldest uniform company in existence is Ostwald Uniform Company.
Mm-hmm.
Stanberry, I think, is the oldest. I wrote to them and I said, and I sent a picture of the old Columbia Brass Band uniform, which we have a picture of that maybe we can see later.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, we want to duplicate this. I don't have a lot of money, but I'm forming a band as part of a bicentennial project. Can you help me out? Not only did they help me out, they duplicated it perfectly.
Wow. Although
we went to a nice reddish color, which I don't believe was the original color, but they put us on their bicentennial cover catalog.
Oh, there you go.
And almost gave it to us for free, which of course was really nice. And then that band, at the time I was secretary treasurer of College Band Directors National Association.
Mm-hmm.
So when we had a big conclave in Berkeley, I took the band there. And in 76, 1976, not a lot of people were doing living music history projects. And Ken Burns had not yet come out with the Civil War doc. And so that was really well received. And by then I had those instruments that I had mentioned that we saw in the museum. They were all restored.
Wow.
One was a German, the piston E-flat was a German-made instrument from probably the 1860s, but the rotary valve was a Czech horn from Czechoslovakian horn from around mid-1840s, I think.
Wow.
It's still there. We used that. Pretty good player. And I realized a couple of the original tunes. Professors during the Gold Rush era were like the town music teachers. And they composed original pieces. Your previous guests, we know about Peter's Saxhorn Journal and all of those books that everybody else, Port Royal Brass Band, and all of those great books that all the East Coast and Southeast bands played. But a lot of these professors, as they were called, that had the brass bands of the Gold Rush, also wrote original tunes. And so I realized some of those just based on a few parts that I had. If I could get the two apart, if I could get the melody, I could often recreate those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, was that so? Those were all pulled from the part books that you saw in the museum from the Columbia Brass Band.
Yeah.
Were those part books complete, or was it just kind of what you were just saying, like tuba and cornet melody?
Unfortunately, not. The closest I got to complete arrangements, very few, and this is a sad tale. The Gold Rush brought people from all over the world, as you can imagine. And they had they either brought their instruments with them or very quickly before the end of the 1850s, were able to get instruments through music stores in either Sacramento or San Francisco. It happened very quickly. Of course, they had to go around the horn on ships.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like, Amazon Prime months. But it's just like everything else in the gold rush. The people that made all the money during the gold rush were not the people that were out at the mines or at the, out with their gold pans. They were the merchants. They were the people that bought up land, who eventually were the people that financed the railroad. They were the people that ended up making all the money. So, they saw the possibilities for things, and music stores made an incredible amount of money. So they had music, sheet music, instruments, etc. But there was one family. There was a little village, an enclave called Soulsbyville. It was named after a family, and these were Cornish miners that came from Cornwall, England. And after they had pretty much played out the rivers and creeks, and they were unfortunately raping the hillsides with these hydraulic hoses that were, and unfortunately you can still see it today around Columbia, Sonora, and various parts of the Motherload, where just ravaged these hillsides to try to get out gold that way. They went to the deep shaft mining. Well, who better to do that kind of mining than people who were miners in Cornwall, England? So they came over. They also, as a couple of your previous guests have mentioned, had a big brass band tradition in Great Britain. The miners' bands, very popular. Factory bands, very popular. Contests, one of your guests mentioned a couple of times, very popular still to today. In fact, there's a national contest that's held every year at Royal Albert Hall with the best of these bands. The Black Dyke Mills Band is one of the ones that's very famous. Well, this goes back, a couple centuries. So there were two families in Soulsbyville that were both very musical. And the Nichols and the Burdens, Burdens. By the way, I did, from photographs that I found in Columbia, a lot of them had the names of people who were in the picture in the back. And I went and found some of those families that were still in and around Columbia and Sonora and interviewed them, taped interviews.
Wow.
Found out about music. Anyway, these two families still had some music from the brass bands, which were no longer in existence, unfortunately. But the one holy grail that I had hoped to find, the Burdens and the Nichols combined to have the Soulsbyville Brass Band, which also had a marvelous uniform, by the way.
Nice.
Participated in the 1850s and 60s, there was a yearly brass band competition, by the way, in that area. And the winner, it was held in Groveland, which is over toward Yosemite. And the winner got this beautiful banner, which they got to keep every year for a year. And so they had this marvelous uniform. I had pictures, etc. Well, so I went and interviewed some folks that were in their 80s and 90s of both families. And I said, I'm really looking for some of this music because I have this historic band, and can you help me out? And Mrs. Nichols said, she's in her, you got a picture of this because it's so iconic. And she's in the front of her old wood frame home, and she's rocking away. And she said, well, Professor Brungess, let me say, she says, I can remember so-and-so and so-and-so, and he was the last band director, or band leader, or whatever she called him. And when he died, there was nobody left to do the band. So we put all of his belongings and all his clothes, and they threw all that music and burned it all up on a funeral pyre.
Yikes.
Wow.
So here was, Lord knows how much original brass band music that they saw no value in because there was nobody. And I guess that would have been maybe in the 30s.
Yeah, man.
40s that she remembered. She was much younger then, but she remembered them burning all his stuff, including all this music. And I wanted to cry.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's rough. Oh man.
That's very tough.
But that's what happened. And then a lot of it because of wood frame buildings in that area. And that's true of Sacramento and even of San Francisco. Many fires. And a lot of it was lost.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
So, yeah.
So with your research, with finding the repertoire that you were able to find and stuff, were you able to kind of pinpoint what the standard instrumentation was for bands of that period? Because I know, like, you're mentioning that they had competitions like the British did or do, and like we do currently have here. But I know on the East Coast, those brass bands weren't so uniform and standardized with like numbers of musicians like the British competitions are. So were you able to find what the California instrumentation was?
Just based on what I've seen in the photographs. And they seem to be anywhere from 15 to 17 to 23 players, usually a couple E flat cornets. I have seen some keyed bugles, but mostly piston or rotary valve E flats, B flats, tenor horns. Again, mainly because the photographs are not that clear. Tubas, at least 2 or 3 tubas. Alto horns, definitely. But, moderate sized groups, because I'm sure this is true. I know this is true based on the Homespun America, Hunsberger's wonderful box set, where part of that is Civil War era. A lot of that music was used for dancing.
Yeah.
You have part of that recording is social orchestra music. So these bands were not just always used for military and civic holiday celebrations. They were also dance bands. And,
good point.
In the Gold Rush era, yes, they were associated with militia. And one of the things that I know you were interested in was Civil War, and yes, there was a lot of activity here during the Civil War, believe it or not. But that's another topic. But these bands played more for dances and balls, but they had a completely different uniform, as I suspect was the case with the East Coast and Southeast bands, for their militia, for their military responsibilities. So it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing. They had a dual role, and they often had completely different repertoire. As is the case with the Hunsberger Homespun America, you get to hear, for example, a young Alan Vizzuti on those social orchestra recordings,
Unfortunately, not on period instruments, though.
Yeah, that's true. Not on period instruments, which is, as I learned more, because I was so ignorant about this stuff, finally, when I got to put together the Gold Rush Cornet Band, which was, made up of all professional players, which that was 93 and 94, with, a lot of Rob Stewart's collection, and you've interviewed Rob a couple times. Bill Reichenbach, some of his instruments, Les Benedict, some of his instruments. These were LA studio players. Steve Sharpey was, one of the guys that put this concept together. Steve also went on, after we stopped doing the band, did a number of recordings on keyed bugle, an instrument that Rob built for him. But that recording, which you guys have, the Gold Rush Cornet Band, those were all original instruments. And the difference in the sound, and the later research that I did, where I actually found in the Eleanor McClatchy Music Collection in Sacramento, where I found original music finally, complete scores. And then to hear them, for me, was such a revelation, something that you're used to. You guys are used to that. You've had guests on that know that stuff, that have their collections. You've been playing that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. It took me until 1993 and getting that band together and putting those scores together and to actually hear that sound. It's glorious.
I never kind of thought of it that way, that, for Chris and I, all these albums are out here now, and we're able to go hear, years and years and years of research and hard work, in the form of a CD that people like yourself have put together. So I've never quite thought of it that way. So that's neat. I did have one question to kind of just pull back a little bit, maybe zoom out. We talked, you were just mentioning how these bands out in California played for, they did have some kind of militia duties, but they also, played a lot of civilian balls and things. Where mm-hmm. in all your research, were you able to determine like kind of who these musicians were? Like, were these bands made up of miners or, people who came out, to maybe capitalize on some of those business opportunities during the gold rush, or who were in these bands, if you were able to find that out?
I think initially, for the most part, everybody came out to find gold. And there were, there are books and books. I have a whole library here, which you can't see, of books about people who were disappointed, but then ultimately saw other possibilities and opened mercantiles, what were like general stores mm-hmm. or restaurants. There was a very well-known enterprise that opened up tent like hostels up by the Diggins, where people could come and get a decent meal, bathe. They had cots, there were pop-up bars up in the Diggins. I mean, people, Yankee ingenuity was rampant. And it was, the landowners like Stanford and all these guys, the big four, I can't remember who all the big four were now, it's up in my library, who put together all the money for the railroad, the Transcontinental Railway. One of the pieces on my CD, in fact, was about that, which we recorded. But yeah, they came from all walks of life, but originally they all came here to strike it rich. But very few did. There were tales about, and they were all exaggerated, but some of them were true. A farmer out plowing land and found a rock-sized nugget of gold mm-hmm. as he was tilling the land, and there are pictures of some of those. They were just everyday people. There were actual miners' bands that I know of. And in the Wetterman, in my book, the Journal of August Wetterman. It's titled Gold Rush Maestro, the Journal of August Wetterman. You know, he was a conservatory trained professional musician who came around the horn specifically to play professionally in San Francisco and Sacramento with some of his cronies from the Swedish Conservatory, because that's where the money was. And he played, and there were, by the 1860s, there were operas coming in from Europe, from New York, from Australia. He was playing in opera orchestras. He has a famous quote about playing in a famous circus band, the Lee and Marshall Circus Band. And, you know, some of his buddies and some of the tales that he talks about, some of his gigs, sound very similar to some of the gigs that people, some of the gigs, and talks about playing 3 times during the 4th of July and coming home after the last one and his lip hanging down, you know, things that some of us experienced. But they were, you know, there were some professionals like him, but most of them were just average people who were part-time musicians. As I said, a lot of theater, though. There was a tremendous amount of theater.
We're kind of able to then just identify that Gold Rush brass bands, you know, weren't necessarily brass bands that were like playing in the field while people were searching for gold, kind of like in a way that like bands were playing during fighting during the Civil War or something. But I do know that maybe this is a loose generalization. You can maybe help refine this a little bit. But my understanding is that in California and in the West, that, you know, that there's these kind of Gold Rush era bands, but then the other term that I'm familiar with are like cowboy bands or cowboy brass bands. Would there be a distinction between those, or are those just different, or are those just brass bands that had different like functions, but they all kind of got out there for the same reason initially?
Well, the cowboy bands are just show bands, you know. We actually did, the Gold Rush Cornet Band actually played at the Gene Autry Museum. That was after the end of our tour. Second time we went to the Great American Brass Band Festival. We got a chance to see, you know, the Wild Bill Hickok exhibit and some of their from their band, and you know, some of the displays and instruments and the big bass drum and all that stuff. But those were show bands. The Gold Rush bands were really, I don't think, any different in function than what you had in the East or the Southeast. I mean, I can really quickly give you an example of what they did.
Yeah, please, that'd be awesome.
That'd be great.
In the spring of, if you bear with me, in the spring of 1851, so this is just very early, the Columbia Brass Band, along with 6,000 to 8,000 men, escorted the first woman they had seen in months into their gaily decorated town. So, you know, that was a big deal. They hadn't seen a woman, and what she was doing there, we don't know. In 1855, August Wetterman, who is the subject of my book, a transplanted Swedish bandmaster, was hired to lead the band of Lee and Marshall Circus, which toured the mining camps twice that year. And then it was Wetterman that formed the Sacramento Union Brass Band in 1856. In 1857, still early, the Columbia Brass Band led the May Day procession to Cole's Ranch near Sonora, and later the Sonora German Brass Band. See, they make these designations because the bands had people made up from different countries, ergo different literature too, right? We had Italian bands, we had German bands, we had the Soulsbyville Band, that was the British brass band, you know, so they had different literature too. So The 1857 Columbia Brass Band led the May Day procession to Coles Ranch near Sonora, and later the Sonora German Brass Band, under the direction of Professor Schmitz, performed a concert with the Sonora Glee Club. Afterwards, a ball began at 6 p.m. and continued until 4 o'clock in the morning. In November 1858, Faxon's Sonora Band and the Columbia Brass Band led a procession in celebration of the opening of the floodgates of the new high flume. It was entitled A Grand Water Celebration. The latter played for ceremonies at the end of the procession. The Sacramento Union Brass Band, this was Wetterman's band, performed in San Francisco in 1858 for the celebration in honor of the laying of the Atlantic cable when Queen Victoria sent the first message over the cable to President James Buchanan. In 1863, the Tuolumne Courier mentions the Columbia Cornet Bands performing Mozart, Beethoven, and Rossini with great fidelity. See, we're talking about a 30-mile radius in the southern Motherload. And I've already mentioned 5 or 6 or 7 different brass bands existing in one small area.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of similar type of things that other bands that, we're familiar with would do, similar town functions. Seems like they were an important and source of pride for the towns and for the surrounding area.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And except that instead of being in an environment which, has a history that goes back to the Revolution and before, everything there was brand new. And it was almost a utopian society because there was a lot of it was lawless. So it was a really wild and woolly time, but every little town, people did the best they could. And the brass bands were literally, and there's a quote in here from Mark Twain from when he was there from his book, Roughing It, where he said the brass bands were one of the first indications of civilization.
Well, there you
go. Some sense of culture.
I'm really interested in this idea of the repertoire also that you've been talking about this whole time and stuff. Something, Kenneth, that you and I talked about on the phone a few weeks ago when we first talked. You mentioned the repurposing of certain tunes and certain composers, specifically Foster and some minstrel songs. Can you maybe talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. Stephen Foster was in the 1850s a super rock star. And his tunes were, everybody knew them. Everybody sang them. They played them on the piano in their parlors. If you had a guitar or a mando, or if you had a banjo, But during the Gold Rush, a couple of these tunes like Camptown Races and Old Susanna, they substituted Gold Rush specific lyrics to them. That's a took that from a 1984 vinyl recording by the Dorado Brass Band that I co-led with a wonderful human being, the late Captain Ray Hicks, who knew more about military band music than anybody on the planet. And unfortunately, he left us, it's been about 15 years ago. But he started the old Arizona Brass Band, which you may not be familiar with. But Ray Hicks was an incredible guy, and he was the one that was playing some of that E-flat stuff you heard on there. But we did this recording in 84. That was, of course, old Susanna, but the substitute lyrics are, I sailed from Salem City with a washbowl on my knee. I'm going to California, the gold dust for to see. It rained all night the day I left, the weather, it was dry. The sun so hot I froze to death. Oh, brothers, don't you cry. Oh, California, that's the land for me. I'm going to San Francisco with a washbowl on my knee. I'll soon be in old Frisco, and there I'll look around. And when I find the gold lumps there, I'll pick them off the ground. I'll scrap the mountains clean, my boys. I'll drain the rivers dry. A pocket full of rocks bring home. Oh, brothers, don't you cry.
The thing that's super interesting to me about that is that, you know, on the East Coast, and when we're dealing with the Civil War, you know, that a lot of the music, you know, has some questionable backgrounds and some difficult conversations, you know, important ones that need to be had, but definitely some difficult topics surrounding the origin of a lot of music. And Stephen Foster's, you know, music is, you know, usually front and center. It's Stephen Foster and Dixie are like the two things that we always have to kind of confront. So the thing that's super interesting to me about Oh Susanna is that that's a Stephen Foster tune that we know was arranged now for a band of that period. You know, obviously we have the brass band journal, the Friedrich, which is a lot of Stephen Foster brass band stuff too. But Oh Susanna, you know, being a Foster band piece where, yes, the melody was still written by Foster for the use, you know, in minstrel shows, but it's kind of been like reappropriated by the Gold Rush seekers out in California and kind of gave it new meaning with that same popular melody that everybody recognizes.
Yeah, I mean, it's that, you know, whole argument of can you separate, you know, what something was originally for from the things it was eventually transformed into. And I think this is an example of, like, in the Civil War, there are examples of tunes that the Confederacy put their own lyrics to for their cause. And I would argue that, you know, well, not argue, but it's very clear, like, this is an example of that kind of working the other way, where it started in you know, for use in a minstrel show and then was changed to something much less harmful. I guess. I would rather it work that way than the other way.
There were also some lyrics that were not, to my mind, acceptable.
Sure.
For everybody. But also along those lines, even before and during and after the Civil War, there was it was a pretty integrated, the Gold Rush Society was pretty integrated. There were a number of Black musicians in amongst the brass bands, and I have pictures of those, which I found interesting. I have not been able to identify them, but that to me would indicate, I guess for better, we call them African Americans, in that society that were very much accepted. They were out there in amongst the miners, and some of them were even merchants, and just accepted along with everybody else in this almost utopian society.
So these California Gold Rush bands were out, you know, in California during the Civil War, and a lot of, you know, the Civil War mainly took place on the on the East Coast. What was their activity like during the Civil War? How were they involved?
Well, that's a very good question, because you wouldn't think that because of where we were situated geographically that there would be much at all. But there were a couple major U.S. Military installations. One was at Alcatraz before it became the famous federal prison. It actually was a Civil War prison, which is now beneath the existing federal prison, and Fort Point, which is close to the present day San Francisco Marina. There was an installation that had a band. And in fact, my book subject, August Wetterman, had some association there as a part-time substitute conductor. But the main thing was that the Golden Gate, not the bridge. A lot of people, when they think about the Golden Gate, they obviously think of the bridge, but the Golden Gate was the name of the entrance to the bay, which was also a very treacherous entrance. And that had to be protected because California, or at least the North, was very pro-union. LA, by the way, was Confederate, was pro-South. But because of all the gold, very early on, troops were sent to Fort Point and Alcatraz and the Presidio, which has been an installation. Now it is no longer inhabited, but the Presidio through World War I, World War II was U.S. Troops were stationed there. But the funny story is, in addition to having one or two bands, U.S. military bands there were gunnery installations placed in the hills, in the headlands, in an effort to do a triangulation to prevent any Confederate ships to come into the bay. And the story is that this was a very scientific attempt, the way they had these guns triangulated to make sure that no Confederate ships could ever get into the bay. And they even put out a decoy boats in the bay, and they tried, and they could never, ever sink the decoy. And they, by the way, where those were now, they have been replaced during World War II and after, in the Cold War, with Nike missile installations are there. They're no longer there, but they were replaced eventually with Nike missile installation. But in fact, there was quite a bit of Civil War activity there, but mainly because the Confederates would have liked to have gotten a hold of all of that gold and been able to control, because millions of dollars were going out of there in ships, and of course overland too, but mainly ships going around the Horn, etc. So that's that story. The Dorado Brass Band became the resident brass band of Old Sacramento, which is a beautiful restored town, very commercial, unfortunately now. But when I moved to Sacramento in '83, this was on leave from teaching at Humboldt State, ostensibly to do work on my doctorate. I received a number of grants to gain access to the Sacramento Museum and History Division's archives. Within those archives I got special permission, which took a lot of doing, to get access to the Eleanor McClatchy music collection, or her California collection. Within that was an amazing music collection, which is where I discovered both the original published versions of the Wetterman Journal, as well as all kinds of his notes and letters, which was for me an incredible gold mine. No one knew about it. I had seen some references to it in other places, but she had the real deal. And these scores or score reductions, not just piano pieces, but actual score reductions where it would say piccolo or indicate actual reductions, 3-line score reductions, from which I then realized the arrangements that are on the CD, the tunes like the Hank Monk Schottisch, the Railroad Gallop, which I had mentioned in my reading earlier by Gungle, the Flood Mazurka, which is an incredible piece of music, very programmatic, sounds like the flood is coming. The Sacramento City Guards Quick Step, which is actually Wetterman's own composition he wrote for his own band, which is really a delightful and really shows his European sensibilities or roots. All of those I discovered within her collection, and some others. So that was really a gold, my own personal eureka, I found it, gold mine. I published some articles. I got a grant from City Arts. I got a grant from the state. I got a grant from the Sacramento Merchants, and most important, the now defunct Musicians Union Recording Trust Fund, which allowed us to put the El Dorado Brass Band on a performance situation where the grant paid 51%, and the Musicians Union Trust Fund paid 48% of our salary for weekly concerts in Old Sacramento.
There you go.
That no longer exists, but it was great for a year or so. And, the grant also paid for uniforms. Ray Hicks, the gentleman, the late Conrad Ray Hicks, already had a Civil War recreation band through the National Guard prior to my coming. I came there wanting to form a town band as the one I was subscribing. He and I joined forces. So, as was the case with most of these bands, we had a Civil War, typical standard Civil War issue uniform with kepis, the whole thing with the standard issue. And we had a town band uniform, which we wore for the Musicians Union Trust Fund gigs, the grant gigs, which was a completely different thing. We did, for Ray's gigs, we did Civil War reenactment stuff in various places. It was, I guess, like other bands in the East Coast and the Southeast, you had two uniforms. You did do maybe two different types of gigs. I'm sure you have Civil War reenactment stuff in the East Coast and the Southeast, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Ray and I didn't always agree. We had these chicken and egg arguments. I was always of the opinion that the town bands came first, and that they were conscripted, or they were asked to be a part of the militia as a patriotic duty.
Mm-hmm.
And but anyway, we did Chautauquas, we did balls in both uniforms. We had some beautiful old halls and theaters that were reconstructed and with people dressed up in Victorian uniforms. Oh my God, I have some pictures, looks like something out of a Ken Burns documentary. I mean, they were beautiful. I mean, and playing. These guys, I guess, were pretty versatile. I don't know how typical that was, but apparently there were people out here during the gold rush that were versatile enough. So, on a break, they would pick up a different instrument and play social orchestra stuff while the other brass guys were resting their chops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that Francis Johnson, a lot of his bands or groups that he was leading in Philadelphia before the Civil War did that. And I think Sue Kinney, who did a lot of research on the Manchester Cornet Band, I think she mentioned that they did that as well. I think that was maybe not, every band did that, but I think that was a pretty common practice. Like you're saying, it just made them more versatile, and they were able to take more gigs and also not murder their faces. So
Bill Gay and John Connors, like they do that with their band. They try to do the string half and the band half when they can. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that tradition's being kept alive as well.
Yeah.
Segueing into, the Gold Rush Cornet Band, somehow around 1993, a guy named Stephen Sharpie, spelled Charpie, soloist with the Disneyland Band. That used to be the cream of the crop. A lot of studio players were in that band, as was Steve Sharpie. And he and Les Benedict, who is also a studio player, who used to, by the way, be the solo euphonium and E flat alto player with Mr. Jack Daniels' Silver Cornet Band. They found out about the research that I had done in Sacramento with, it must have been an article or something that they read, and that I had found original Gold Rush music, but had never recorded it. And long story short, we got together in LA, and they said, well, we've got all of these, between us and this guy named Rob Stewart, we got these old instruments. We would like to put this together with your music. Plus there's this guy named Bill Reichenbach. Now I'd heard of Bill Reichenbach, with the greatest studio bass trombone player, alive today, one of the best ever, who is a super arranger who will write a bunch of other stuff for us in the same era, the same idea. Mm-hmm. And then there's this thing called the Great American Brass Band Festival. We'd like to go there. And we have contacts there because there's never been a band from the West Coast there. And there's certainly never been a Gold Rush band. And they never even knew most of those people there never even knew there was a Gold Rush. There were Gold Rush bands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely overlooked for sure. Definitely.
Yeah. So that's kind of how that came about. So I had already made these scores, and I sent them down to Reichenbach, and he liked them. He made a few changes here and there because he was playing different tuba. He made, and that was before I owned Finale. That was before I owned Sibelius, so these were all handwritten stuff. And so they handpicked 17 players. I had nothing to do with that. And so we started rehearsing at Rob Stewart's shop. And I was playing first cornet, I guess. I don't remember now. The first rehearsal, and I think Rob was playing Alpha Clyde on the stuff. And my God, I started to cry. I mean, I had tears. I had tears streaming as I was playing. I had tears streaming down my cheeks because, I'd gone through this stuff. I mean, I'm starting to feel a little bit weird right now. I'd gone through this stuff. I'd found it, I'd orchestrated, but it was almost kind of like giving birth.
Yeah.
And then actually hearing with the instruments, I mean, I can't explain what it was like. And of course, all these cats played it flawlessly, read it. I'd had some pretty good players, and I was a college and university conductor. I had good students, but hell, not like this. Mm-hmm. Long story short, we got accepted. We sent a demo. We got accepted like that. We got on the main stage Saturday night. I did a talk for the Sonic Society the Friday. They were not receptive, by the way. They just didn't want to accept the fact that there was anything happening west of the Mississippi, in spite of what I showed them. And I had graphics, but got through it, basically a presentation, but we just knocked them dead Saturday night and just blew them away. And got asked back the next year. So we went back 94. We did we did the recording before 94 and came back. And that was before CDs. So we had this little booklet that went along with, which is part of, what I'm going to be able to offering all of the viewers, this little booklet in what looked like a gold bag with the drawstring and a cassette. Yeah, it was kind of a cool thing. Well, now we have the CD, of course, which it has been enhanced. We recorded it at a studio in North Hollywood. And there's a guy, a good friend of Bill Reichenbach's, did the engineering and the mix. His name is Gary Grant, who, if you know Earth, Wind, and Fire, Gary was lead trumpeter and did all the charts for Earth, Wind, and Fire. So he did it for a labor of love on 2-inch tape. And then we got it down to one of those little digital things, but I still own the 2-inch tapes, the reels. Yeah. I mean, everybody did it. I mean, we got some money, but none of these studio cats ever was in it for the money. It was something that, and Reichenbach wrote some beautiful, beautiful arrangements, which unfortunately are not on the CD because I wanted the CD to only be the authentic stuff. Bill could probably make that other stuff available. So those are the kinds of things that the Gold Rush Cornet Band did that were fun. And lots of thanks to Steve Sharpey and Bill Reichenbach and Les Benedict.
With your experience with those brass bands, did you ever bite the bullet and purchase your own period instrument?
This is, I got this from Rob.
Oh, cool.
It's a Diston 1880s Diston cornet, large bore, B flat. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful horn. Rare because it's a large bore.
Hmm.
It was in primo condition. I had Rob looking for it for me for a while. And then I have a French Courtois there, which is, it's not period, but it's early 1920s, which is incredibly rare. Incredibly rare. It's, that was you had to own that horn to play and to be a trumpet major in the Paris Conservatory.
Oh.
It's also a large bore B flat. There's only about 7 or 8 of those left in the country, but this is my baby. I had a rotary valve E flat, which I donated. It was an okay player. I donated to a friend of mine at Humboldt State who kind of set the way for him to follow me in there.
Well, Kenneth, this has been a great conversation. We really thank you for your time today and all the great information about all the California bands that you've given us. We think it's a great episode to throw into the mix. Where can people go if they want to find out more about the 3 bands that we've been talking about in the episode, or your book, or the CD?
Well, thanks. I really appreciate having had the opportunity to do this, especially having been sequestered. I've been so lonely. Have a chance. Obviously, I've been very shy. So, but yes, the website is California Gold and Brass Works. That's all one. California Gold and Brass Works.com. And that's the website, which maybe you can see later. But I've got as far as getting a hold of the book, you can get a special offer that really is quite competitive with what is offered on my Amazon webpage. They're asking. It's not my price, but Amazon wants $24.95 for my book entitled Gold Rush Maestro, The Journal of August Wetterman. At $24.95, I can arrange just for your viewers to have the book with this really what I think is a really nice booklet with all of the program notes and anecdotal information and some stuff from Mark Twain and other things in there that you can't find in the book, can't find anywhere else actually, because it's a lot of original research. And then the CD for $20.95, the whole package, which I think is quite reasonable. And the way to find out how to order that is merely by sending me an email to Brungess. So K is for Ken. Brungess is Brungess @gmail.com. So it's kbrungess@gmail.com. If you'll send me an email, I'll tell you how you can get the booklet, program information, and the CD for $20.95. Such a deal.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's super generous. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you guys. I appreciate your time.
Thank you again to Kenneth Brungess for coming on to the Early American Brass Band podcast. We really hope you all enjoyed learning about and listening to music from the California Gold Rush era.
Yeah, definitely. You'll definitely want to check out our show notes for this episode to go more in depth on what you heard. And as always, you can find us on all social media platforms and YouTube We have a Patreon page if you'd like to support the show. And we have a Teespring store if you'd like to get some physical merch that has like the show logo on it and all that good stuff. So links to all of that is up on our website. That's eabbpodcast.com.
This episode's featured album is by the Gold Rush Cornet Band. Released in 1993, the album is titled Motherload, Musical Nuggets from the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, as performed by the Gold Rush Cornet Band. This is the album that Kenneth was talking about that they recorded prior to their second appearance at the Great American Brass Band Festival, and this is also the album that you can listen to on their website. But if you take advantage of Kenneth's generous offer of combining the CD along with the program notes, which are rather extensive, they appear as more of a pamphlet, and his book, then you can take advantage of that deal by going over to our show notes or by emailing Kenneth directly.
Yeah, it's a screaming deal. Please reach out to Kenneth if you want to take advantage of that generous offer and pick up some goodies. You got the book, the program notes, and the CD, and you can email him for that. And thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you in the next one.